The 2025 Indiana Fever season didn't begin as an underdog story. It began with hope, with hype, and with the kind of anticipation that only comes when a franchise believes it has finally turned the corner. Caitlin Clark, the generational star, had ignited a wave of excitement the moment she stepped into the league. Aliyah Boston, already a dominant presence inside, promised stability and power. Around them, the Fever had built a roster full of grit, shooters, and defenders, ready to carve out a new identity. For once, Indiana wasn't supposed to just compete. They were supposed to matter. But in sports, the moment you start believing you're safe, the game reminds you of its cruelty. Mid-July, the sound inside Gainbridge Fieldhouse wasn't the usual roar of fans. It was the stunned silence of watching Clark clutch her right leg, a groin injury, severe enough to sideline her, long enough to change everything. What had felt like a steady climb toward contention suddenly teetered, and that was only the beginning. Sydney Colson's torn ACL, Ari McDonald's foot injury, Sophie Cunningham's MCL, Chloe BBY's knee, Deary's Dantas out with a concussion. One by one, Indiana's roster wasn't just thinning, it was unraveling. In just weeks, 6 of the Fever's most important players were either sidelined or battling pain. The blueprint of the season wasn't just torn, it was shredded. For most teams, this is where the obituary would be written. Season over, playoff dreams dead. Time to rebuild. But for the Indiana Fever, the breaking point became the foundation. Coach Stephanie White didn't flinch. She didn't echo the media's doubts or give excuses. Instead, she reminded her team of a philosophy she'd been planting all season long. One step at a time, one foot in front of the other. Grace, dignity, perseverance. Her words weren't just post-game sound bites, they were anchors. They told her players that even when everything falls apart, identity doesn't have to. The Fever signed players on hardship contracts just to fill the lineup. New faces walked into the locker room mid-season, barely knowing the system, yet being asked to step into major minutes against the best in the league. That chaos could have splintered the team. Instead, it connected them. This wasn't about star power anymore. It wasn't about statistics or individual brilliance. It was about survival, about finding out whether this group of women could turn pain into pride and doubt into defiance. Steph White later said it best. They never blinked, and that's where the story of the 2025 Indiana Fever truly begins. Not with Caitlin Clark's highlight threes, not with Boston's dominance in the paint, but with the moment when the season should have collapsed under its own weight, and didn't. When the injuries stacked up, Indiana's season should have faded quietly into the background. No one would have blamed them. After all, you can't lose your superstar, half your rotation, and still expect to go toe-to-toe with teams stacked with all-stars. Yet somehow, that's exactly what the Fever did. With Caitlin Clark sidelined, the spotlight shifted. Kelsey Mitchell, the longest-tenured Fever player, suddenly carried the weight of an entire franchise on her shoulders. She had always been known as a scorer, but now her role demanded something more. She wasn't just the offensive engine anymore. She had to become the heartbeat. She had to lead in the huddles, demand resilience, and show that Indiana wasn't going to let its story be written by injuries. And then came the names no one expected. Players signed on hardship contracts. Women who had been sitting at home or overseas waiting for a call suddenly became lifelines. Odyssey Sims, a veteran most people had written off, stepped onto the floor with a chip on her shoulder. She wasn't just filling minutes. She was reminding everyone that fire doesn't fade with age. Lexie Hull, once seen as a role player, became a defensive anchor and a timely shot maker. With each possession, she made herself indispensable. It wasn't smooth. There were ugly nights, blowout losses, and moments when it looked like the Fever's fight had finally run out. But every time the doubt crept in, someone new stepped up. That became the identity. The next woman up wasn't just a phrase, it was survival. Then came the Commissioner's Cup. By all logic, Indiana shouldn't have even been competitive. They were walking into Minnesota's building, a powerhouse squad with depth, chemistry, and momentum. Analysts predicted a double-digit win for the Lynx, Instead, Indiana shocked the league. Behind Mitchell's scoring outbursts and Boston's relentless energy inside, the Fever pulled off one of the biggest upsets of the season. The win didn't just put points on the board, it sent a message. This wasn't a team rolling over. This wasn't a team waiting for next year. This was a team that would scrap, claw, and fight with whoever was left standing. And as the weeks wore on, something remarkable happened. The Fever began to look less like a patchwork roster and more like a movement. Fans started to believe again. The national media, once quick to dismiss them, began to ask questions. How were they still winning games they had no business winning? How were they staying in playoff contention when most of their roster had been decimated? The answer was simple. They refused to let excuses define them. Indiana was no longer just playing basketball. They were playing with defiance, with a bond forged in hardship. And the more they leaned into that identity, the closer they got to something no one thought possible, a playoff berth. By late August, the narrative around the Indiana Fever had shifted. What was supposed to be a season lost to injuries had transformed into something unexpected, a push for the playoffs. The Fever didn't enter the postseason conversation as favorite. In fact, for most of the league, they were a footnote. Too young, too banged up, too reliant on patchwork lineups. But night after night, they kept grinding. And with every improbable win, the playoff dream crept closer to reality. The locker room energy changed. Every huddle carried more intensity. Steph White reminded them that the pressure wasn't on them. It was on the teams facing them. They expect us to lose, she told them more than once, which means we've got nothing to lose. Play free, play fearless. Kelsey Mitchell was electric. In games that mattered most, she wasn't just scoring. She was carrying Indiana through storms. Her shot-making, her speed, her sheer will to attack the rim became the kind of weapon defenses couldn't always solve. Aliyah Boston, too, grew sharper. Despite constant double teams and foul trouble in key stretches, she became the rock, anchoring the paint on both ends of the floor. And then there were the unsung heroes. Lexie Hull diving on the floor for loose balls. Odyssey Sims hitting clutch shots. Katie Lou Samuelson knocking down threes that silenced hostile arenas. It wasn't about one player anymore. It was about everyone. The defining moment came late in the regular season. With the playoffs hanging in the balance, Indiana faced elimination scenarios in back-to-back games. Both times, they rose to the moment. Mitchell poured in points, Boston dominated the boards, and Sims delivered in crunch time like a veteran who'd seen it all. When the final buzzer sounded, the improbable was real. The Indiana Fever had clinched a playoff berth. For fans, it was more than a milestone. It was proof of something bigger. This was the youngest roster in the league. They had lost half their stars. They had been written off in July. And yet, here they were, marching into October with a chance to shock the world. The atmosphere around the team shifted from survival to belief. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether they belonged, it was how far they could go. And for a franchise that hadn't tasted playoff glory in years, that belief meant everything. The Fever entered Game 5 with no illusions. They weren't supposed to be here. They weren't supposed to push the defending champions to the brink. Yet somehow, they had. And as tip-off approached, the feeling inside the arena was almost cinematic, like history was about to be written one way or another. From the start, every possession felt like life or death. The Aces came out firing, feeding off their crowd, with A'ja Wilson setting the tone in the paint. But Indiana refused to back down. Kelsey Mitchell drove into traffic again and again, finishing through contact, sending a message that the Fever weren't intimidated. Each time the Aces tried to pull away, Indiana clawed right back. Midway through the second quarter, Caitlin Clark, still sidelined, stood at the edge of the bench in warm-ups, clapping, shouting encouragement. Her presence was a reminder of what had been lost, but also what still could be gained. Every time Indiana hit a shot, she leapt up, fist pumping, willing her team to believe. The third quarter shifted everything. Mitchell's collapse sent a shockwave through the arena. She had been Indiana's constant, their scorer, their closer. Without her, it felt like a dam breaking. Players huddled around her, some wiping away tears, others staring at the floor in disbelief. Yet out of that moment of despair came a spark. Odyssey Sims took the reins. She played like a woman who refused to let her career end quietly. Step-back jumpers, floaters, impossible mid-range shots. She hit them all, silencing the Vegas crowd. Lexie Hull fed off her energy, knocking down a pair of threes that kept Indiana alive. For every punch the Aces threw, the Fever had an answer. The fourth quarter was chaos in its purest form. Lead changes on nearly every possession. Players diving on the floor like their lives depended on it. Coaches screaming, crowds roaring, referees barely keeping control. When Boston picked up her fifth foul, the Fever bench erupted in protest. But Boston stayed in, walking a razor's edge, knowing one more whistle would end her night. With less than 10 seconds left in regulation, Indiana had the ball, down by 1. Sims held it at the top, the crowd deafening. She drove, pulled up just inside the arc, and let it fly. The shot bounced off the rim, rattled, and fell out. Gasps filled the arena. Time expired. Overtime, in the extra period, momentum swung like a pendulum. But slowly, it tilted toward Vegas. A controversial offensive foul on Boston. A missed call on Hull's drive. A technical assessed to the Fever bench. Each whistle chipped away at Indiana's hope. And with every Aces basket, the clock became a dagger. When the buzzer finally sounded, the scoreboard told a cruel truth. Indiana's magical run was over. The Fever players sank into their seats, drained. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence. For them, it wasn't just a loss. It was the shattering of a dream they had built with their blood, sweat, and belief. Yet, in that silence, something powerful was about to emerge. Words that would change the way this story was remembered. The locker room after Game 5 was heavy, suffocating. The air was thick with disappointment, the kind that clings to every silence. Players sat with towels over their heads, shoes unlaced but not removed, as if even taking them off felt like admitting it was truly over. For some, tears came freely. For others, there was nothing, just a blank stare at the floor. Kelsey Mitchell, who had given everything until her body broke, sat quietly, head bowed, ice packs strapped to her legs. Aliyah Boston leaned back in her chair, her eyes red, replaying every whistle, every missed opportunity. Lexie Hull's jersey was drenched in sweat and tears, her hands still trembling from the intensity of the moment. Odyssey Sims sat with her elbows on her knees, shaking her head, whispering to herself about what could have been. It was the kind of silence only heartbreak creates, a silence that can destroy a team or transform it. That's when Steph White walked into the center of the room. She didn't shout. She didn't scold. She didn't even talk about the loss. Instead, she looked at her players, one by one, face by face, and told them the truth. "You gave me everything," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Every single one of you. You never blinked. No matter what happened, no matter how much was thrown at you, you stood together. And that is what I'm proud of tonight." The players lifted their heads. Some wiped tears, others just listened. White's words cut through the fog of defeat. She wasn't talking about scoreboards or trophies. She was talking about character, about resilience, about something no box score could capture. "You are the example," she continued. "The example of what happens when a team refuses to quit. The world saw it, the fans felt it, and you should feel it too. We didn't lose tonight. We showed them who we are." In that moment, the weight in the room shifted. The tears were still there, the pain was still sharp, but the defeat no longer defined them. The players began to nod, to lean forward, to believe that this wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of something much larger. Lexie Hull later recalled that moment, saying, "Coach reminded us that we were part of something bigger than just this game, and I'll never forget it." Odyssey Sims described it as the speech that turned heartbreak into fuel. Even Caitlin Clark, sidelined and unable to play, told reporters, "I think we learned tonight what kind of team we really are." Steph White's message didn't erase the pain of Game 5, but it reframed it. Instead of a tragic ending, it became a powerful origin story. The Indiana Fever weren't just a team that lost in the first round. They were a team that had laid the foundation for the future. As the players left the arena that night, heads still heavy but hearts slightly lighter, there was a sense that the Fever had arrived, not in the way they imagined back in training camp, but in the way that matters most. Through fire, through struggle, through the kind of loss that forges champions. The message had been delivered, and the Fever were listening. In the weeks after the heartbreaking loss to Las Vegas, most teams would have quietly slipped into the off-season. Headlines would have faded, the spotlight moved elsewhere, and the story of the Indiana Fever would have been summed up in a single line: a surprise playoff run cut short. But this wasn't just another team, and this wasn't just another ending. The Fever refused to let their story be written that way. As players regrouped and the emotions of Game 5 slowly began to settle, something else began to surface: defiance. They weren't satisfied with being called a good story. They weren't content with moral victories or surprise playoff appearances. They wanted more, and no one embodied that fire more than Sophie Cunningham. She hadn't been able to contribute the way she wanted due to injury, but she made her voice heard. Standing in front of cameras, her tone was sharp, her message crystal clear. "Don't think this was a fluke," she warned. "Don't think we're just happy to be here. Next year, we're coming for everybody." This was just the beginning. It wasn't just talk. Around the Fever locker room, you could feel the belief taking root. The young core, Caitlin Clark, Aliyah Boston, Kelsey Mitchell, Lexie Hull, had just been through the kind of crucible that bonds a team for life. They had taken the reigning champions to the brink with half their roster missing. What would happen when they were healthy? When they had a full season to grow, to gel, to sharpen? Analysts started to take notice. Commentators who once dismissed Indiana as too young or too thin began changing their tone. ESPN panels debated whether the Fever might be a top contender as soon as next year. Writers called them the most dangerous team in the league's future. Inside the Fever organization, the mission was simple: build on the foundation. They weren't tearing down or starting over. They were reinforcing the structure they had already built. A structure made of grit, belief, and unity. Steph White knew it. Her players knew it. And now, the rest of the league knew it too. The Indiana Fever of 2025 weren't defined by their injuries or their heartbreak, or even their loss in Game 5. They were defined by their response. By the way, they kept standing, kept fighting, kept believing when the easy thing to do would have been to quit. For fans, it was the start of something they hadn't felt in years: hope mixed with certainty. Not the blind hope of wishing, but the grounded belief that this team was built to last. So when Sophie Cunningham promised the league that Indiana was coming, it wasn't just bravado. It was a warning forged in the fire of adversity, sealed in the heartbreak of a playoff loss, and carried by the unshakable bond of a team that refused to blink. The 2025 Indiana Fever didn't win a championship, but they won something else: respect, identity, a future. And when the lights dimmed on their season, one truth echoed louder than the heartbreak: this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning.